Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This is the first in my series of video reviews on the Bantam Indiana Jones novels. Now, the Indy novels are unfortunately not often discussed, and for a long time were out of print. They did receive one more print run around the time that Crystal Skull came out, and for my money, that was the one positive thing really to come out of Crystal Skull, which usually I know I'm not alone in the fact that I try to pretend it never happened. But it did see a lot of the Bantam Indy novels get reprinted, but then they went right back out of print again, and you do have to track down all of them, which does take some time. They're not super expensive, but also they did see a variety of different authors write Indy, and not all of them met with a lot of fan love, or none ever quite managed to please all of the fan base. They all had different sort of approaches. So if you were to ask any indie fan about the novels, if they've actually read them, you'd get a different answer if you asked different indie fans which was their favorite. Now, the novel started out in 1991 with this volume, which is Indiana Jones and the Peril at Delphi, written by Rob MacGregor, who had done a wonderful job with his Last Crusade novelization in 1989. As I discussed in my review of that particular novelization, that book's greatest strength was its understanding of Indy's character, the internal monologue, and the dialogue Indy always had with himself. That was the greatest aspect of that novelization, and what really enriched the story of the film for me is reading that. So you get that here in spades. That is the core tenet, I think, of Rob MacGregor writing Indies. He has a great handle on Indy's character and what even Harrison Ford brought to the role. So I never have a problem picturing the Indy of the films when I'm reading Rob MacGregor's Indy, whether in the novelization or his novels. This being the first of the Indy novels, it is a prequel to the films. It takes place, it starts in 1920 in terms of Indy's graduating school, and then it moves to about 2 years later, so 1922, and when all of this takes place primarily in Greece is where the bulk of the novel happens. So you get a little bit of a setup in the opening, and then we jump to basically 2 years later when Indy is further along in his studies in Europe, and then he goes to Greece. So it is a prequel. This is a younger Indy, and we are seeing elements of Indy's character being defined, tested for the first time, strengthened, and by the end of this novel, we are a little bit closer to the Indiana Jones of the films that we know and adore. So in a lot of ways, you could look at this book as very much in the mold of Casino Royale, which Fleming wrote to basically at the end of Casino Royale. That is the last sort of element to solidify and perfect James Bond's character. The events of that book and the ending cements Bond 100% as a literary character. He's like 90% of the way there, and it's that particular story that gets him to 100% of the literary James Bond. Here in Peril at Delphi, you get some of that. So I wouldn't say Indy is fully formed because he's still much younger, and it's only 1922. So this is still 14 years before the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark, or 13 years before the events of Temple of Doom, if you want to go for Temple, because that is also a prequel, technically. So this is never going to be fully the Indiana Jones you know, but the core of his character is there, and it's fun to see these events start to further mold and shape him to be the Indy we know and love. So the book does open with Indy graduating from college and struggling with trying to essentially find his own path in life and deal with the constraints and the desires of his very absent father, whose presence is always there. So that's a nice sort of direct connection to the events of Last Crusade and how Indy has dealt with his father's expectations and the distance between them all his life. It's not overplayed, but it's nicely laid in there. I do think the opening sections, and really I'd say the first half of this book, is where it really hits its stride. I like seeing Indy graduating and then going to study in Paris at the Sorbonne, and struggling to live in Europe for 2 years and figure out where he's going, and does he like the field of academics he's in. He's actually studying linguistics, which is a path his father set him on. So he's not immediately jumping into archaeology. He's having to find his own path and become his own man over the course of this story. But he's really having a hard time of it at first. He doesn't quite know where he's going, and that's it's a very natural thing for anyone with a particular upbringing, which would be, more on the unconventional side. Well, it's there, and it's very natural for, I think, Indiana Jones to find himself in this particular moment. I don't necessarily agree with how he pulls essentially a graduating college prank and what it's actually entailing. That felt a little bit not quite Indy in terms of the actual prank that's pulled that gets him into hot water. But Indy getting into hot water in a university environment, that's perfect. So again, I think anybody could nitpick or do things a little bit differently in terms of doing a sort of young Indy story. But I think the characterization is always on point. And to be quite frank, even though I like things in the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles series, that was more of an edutainment series, and it was so expository in its dialogue and the constant coincidences of Indy always meeting every seemingly important historical figure of that time. He just ran into them and stuff. It really detracted from the experience. So I do really enjoy everything we see here in the first Indy novel as a prequel and a young Indy story, much more than anything I got out of the TV series. But again, that show was an edutainment show. It had education very much on the brain. It was not trying to be a pulpy adventure, which is what Indiana Jones is and always should be. That gets into my other issue with this book. It's not really a pulp adventure either. It has elements of it. It builds elements of a pulp adventure, but it's not a pulp adventure. Basically, what happens to Indy is he is studying under a very bewitching and beautiful professor named Dorian Belicamus, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with pronunciations. But she is going back to the archaeological site at the Temple of Delphi, where, of course, the famous priestess was, and was the oracle of the Grecian gods in mythology. Well, she also is very mysterious and decides on taking Indy with her to this dig site. And it's very obvious that she has ulterior motives. What those are, Indy doesn't know, and we don't know. But it's so much so that Indy has to question even going, and basically decides to go anyway and throw caution to the wind. Of course, they also become lovers, which is an interesting sort of development because it also prefigures the sort of the collegiate interest, if you will, of every female student who is later in Indiana Jones's college classrooms. And if you've read all the script drafts and deleted scenes of Raiders, and of course the novelization as well, you would know that originally Indy did sometimes enjoy flings with his students. So I think MacGregor here was starting to set that ball rolling, because apparently in his vision of Indy, this happened to Indy as a young man, and it was one of his first adult experiences, shall we say. So that's an interesting dynamic that does further Indy's character development, if you will. But he knows he's getting in over his head, essentially, as we start out, and that starts to establish the element of pre-existing danger that always feels like it's lurking under the surface, which does help the more suspenseful or thriller elements of the story. But essentially, they get to the dig site at Delphi, where there are consistent earthquakes that are causing a series of sort of like volcanic gas emissions to start arising, and these are the same types of fumes that apparently the original Oracle of Delphi would inhale and then be able to directly connect with the gods and give her visions of the future that various nobles and kings and people would then follow and use as future predictions. Things get complicated further because she has a back history in terms of being involved in the sort of the like political underworld of Greece and not being a fan of the current government or the king. And she also has another lover who happens to be a colonel in the army, and he has political connections, and so there seems to be a sort of connection with the anti-government forces. There are also locals who are in charge of or head members in a secret cult who are devoted to trying to bring back the actual Oracle of Delphi herself, and seem to believe that Dorian may be the new reincarnation of the Oracle of Delphi. There's also a conniving and rather mysterious other archaeologist who seems to despise Indiana Jones as soon as he shows up. So basically, Indy has no friends here except for the young boy he meets, Nikos, who becomes his sort of sidekick for the story and is able to get into areas that Indy himself cannot get into and sort of be his local guide. And we also see occasionally some of his friends from the opening sequences pop up as well throughout the book. So this is also a book that doesn't get into the metaphysical or the supernatural. So this is a very grounded book that has some elements that could kind of get into the supernatural, particularly the possible effects of the vapors coming out of Delphi on actual people who ingest them or breathe them. Whether you choose to believe in those elements or not is left up to the reader, but it is seemingly trying to shy away or directly avoid the more supernatural elements that do involve in the film stories. This is a bit of a slow burner in terms of the pacing, and once we get to the actual dig site, that's where it really slows down, and you have after this point it becomes pretty much just a relatively enclosed story with all these new characters, each representing a different faction, and you never quite know who is on whose side, and there are a lot of double crosses and a lot of having to try and guess character motivations. So while ostensibly they're working on a dig site and Indiana is mainly tasked with trying to recover and decipher an ancient stone tablet, he very quickly begins to question why he's even there, and is he really there for archaeological reasons? It seems pretty obvious that's a no. So he's constantly looking over his shoulder and trying to guess people's actual motivations. So most of the book, it actually becomes more of a mystery or a mystery thriller. That is a perfect setup. That's perfectly fine, but it's not a pulp adventure. It's not action-driven. There are no gigantic action set pieces. And when we do finally start to get action, it's really only in the final third. And that's where the plot really... It slows down in the middle section, but it's in the final act where it does kind of get a bit jumbled, and it's not always 100% clear what all the motivations are, and it's not as easy to follow the action. So it is a little bit difficult to go through completely, if I'm honest. I had read this a long time ago, but this is my first time coming back to it, and also the first time I've decided to try and read all the novels in chronological order. I do have some good memories of some of the later MacGregor novels and some of the other books after he left the Indy novels, but it definitely did take some concentrated effort to try and keep along with the story. Really, once you get that halfway point where the plot really starts to slow down, but particularly in the last act, it does take some concentrated effort to try and follow along. It's still a good conclusion, and ultimately this is all about building Indy's character. So on that front, The Peril at Delphi achieves its goal, and this moves Indy one step closer to the Indy of the films, and it's an important building block of his characterization. As a pulp adventure, it's not really that kind of book. It's not like the films, and if you come to this expecting a rollicking, fun pulp adventure or, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the early years, you're not going to get that. But you're also not going to get the edutainment of the Young Indy TV series. So basically what I'm trying to say is this is not the opening of Last Crusade, Young Indy. This is young man, young Indy, trying to find his way in the world. And this is an adult novel. This is not a children's novel. There are some nice dark moments. There are some shades of gray. And again, you do have Indy with an actual love interest, and that does go some interesting places. And he knows while carrying on this relationship that he really does not know this other person, and he does not know her motives. And there are points where he thinks literally she could just turn around and kill him at any moment, or that she may be trying to kill him. So there are nice moments of uncertainty throughout. It does feel lived in that sense. So I would say this is a relatively solid start. It's not perfect, and it's not the sort of pulp adventure you're probably looking for in an indie book. This is very character driven. This is again, the whole book is about moving Indiana Jones a couple steps further into full adulthood and moving him closer to the Indiana Jones character of the films. By the end of this book, he's not all the way there, but he is older, wiser, has a few new scars, and he's a couple steps closer to being the Indy of Raiders, essentially. So on those counts, the book succeeds, and I think all Indy fans will get something out of it. Whether it's something you're going to fully enjoy or something you're going to return to a lot, I think depends on if you're coming to this looking for something like the films or looking for a straight adventure novel. Because again, if that's what you're looking for, you're not going to get that here. It's not going to scratch that itch, because really that's not what it's trying to do. This is a character study. So you're going to get more facets of Indy's character, and that being, I think, MacGregor's greatest strength with Indy that we saw in the Last Crusade novelization. It makes perfect sense that that's the focus here, and that's the most rewarding thing, is we get really just invested and enmeshed into Indy's developing character, which makes us appreciate and love and adore the character all the more. So I think this is a good, solid book. I don't think it's perfect. I do have some definite issues with it, but as the start of a character-driven book series further establishing the earlier days of Indiana Jones, it achieves all the goals it set out. Now, in terms of the printing itself, this carries an absolutely gorgeous illustration by Drew Struzan from an original painting, which perfectly captures Harrison Ford. So this, of course, just screams Indiana Jones. This is another reason why these books are so nice to collect, because they have gorgeous cover artwork. Now, this is an earlier printing. It seems like a second printing, but it still has, I don't know how well you can see this, but the actual title is embossed on the early printing. So that makes these a little bit more desirable than the later ones done for Crystal Skull or ones from the late 90s. Also, you can tell the earlier printings because they are still on the Falcon imprint of Bantam. Later on, I think they just had plain Bantam imprint logos. So if you want to collect the earlier printings for the nice embossing, you always want to look for that Falcon logo. All the spines of the Indy books match pretty nicely. They usually have a different color, but they carry the same font and layout. So when you have them on the shelf, they actually go together quite nicely. The rear is very simple, but gives you a nice sort of plot setup. The inside is, of course, just the novel, but we do get an author photo at the end. The only other thing I'll say about the printing is, because this is from 1991 and it's a first or second printing, There is obviously a little bit of tanning on the pages. I've had this for a couple years, and I do have all the indie novels mostly as original printings, and some of them do have tanning. So that seems to be common to all of the printings I've seen. With the embossing, it's just, I think, a symptom of age, but it's not bad, and it does definitely give you a nostalgic feel. So it seems befitting that you're reading an indie paperbacks and the pages are slightly tanned, giving it that aged flavor, which seems perfect for reading the adventures of a young budding archaeologist in 1922 Greece. So those are my thoughts on rereading Indiana Jones and the Peril at Delphi, the first of the Bantam series of Indiana Jones adult novels. The covers by Drew Struzan on these books are amazing, and I think that is the one thing all fans can agree on is truly outstanding about all the books, whether you like them or not, and whether you like some authors' books more than others. But the MacGregor novels, I think everybody else can also agree, do give great definition to Indy's character and develop Indy's character over the books. Whether you like the books or you like their plots or you don't like some of the, which however you feel about MacGregor's novels, I think everybody can agree they do build Indy's character in satisfying and interesting ways, and only serve to make the character even more interesting and endearing in that sense. I also applaud his efforts to seemingly try and ground the character and stories more. There's a great sense of realism here. There's a lot of the actual history of Delphi, and there is a sense to try and steer away from the more supernatural elements where possible, to always ground this story in a sense of reality. And I do think that is helpful for a younger Indy. And I do like only having the supernatural elements in these kinds of stories only be hinted at or done at the very end, like for example, like in Raiders, or only certain instances in Temple of Doom or Last Crusade. You don't want to overdo those, because if you do that, that takes the reality away, or it pulls the rug out from under you, and you don't have that foundation of reality, and because you lose the illusion of believability. So you want to be very sparing with the supernatural elements, and I do appreciate that MacGregor tries to ground the story as much as humanly possible and steer away from the supernatural. So I'd like a lot of things in this. I do think the first half of the book and the events leading up to Indy getting to Delphi are well done and interesting, and I like the setup of the character relationship between Indy and Dorian, who is his professor. I like the opening with Indy at college graduating. I like Indy trying to find himself, just being a sort of out of his element American studying in Paris and just feeling kind of lost. I love that material. I think is beautifully done. It's just once we actually get to Delphi and we're in Greece where I think the story kind of gets muddled, and it kind of turns a bit here and there, and it does become a book you have to really focus on finishing by that point. It also does the thing where it opens with Indy in a particular predicament and then flashes back to 2 years before of him graduating and then getting to Paris. So basically we have a little teaser opening where we get back to that point about 60 to 70% of the way through the book. And while those can be effective, I'm not particularly a big fan of that. I'd like to just get to that point normally, and we already can tell Indy is heading into danger, so I don't know if that was exactly necessary, but it does put that right out there first and foremost, and it allows us to also start the book with a more action beat or a real cliffhanger in that sense. So this is a book I think that different people will get different things out of. I still think it's a good read, and I would recommend it to all Indy fans if you've not read it before and you've not tried the Bantam novels. But it is very much character focused. It is not a pulp adventure, and it is very different to the experience of watching the films. So don't come to it expecting that. Just try to read it and come to it with an open mind, I think is the best advice. So that's my review of Indiana Jones and the Peril at Delphi. I plan to continue on reading and rereading the series, because again, I've not read all of them, but I've always wanted to, so I decided now was the perfect time to read through the series and then document my thoughts in video form. So I will continue on with this in the next few months and hopefully get through all the Bantam novels, and then maybe start moving on to some of the young Indy books, which I have a few of, but they're actually quite difficult to collect, particularly the later volumes. But I've always wanted to read and dig further into all the printed works of Indiana Jones and the further adventures Jones has in the world of fiction. So now is the perfect time to do so. So with Dial of Destiny with us, now is the perfect time to finally read The Adventures of the Man with the Whip in print form if you never have before. So as always, I hope my babblings about Indy and books and printed literature and book collecting have been at least somewhat fun and informative. And as always, please do keep reading print books, and keep supporting independent bookstores wherever possible, because they always need your help and support. And thank you ever so much for watching.